So here is a short PowerPoint lesson about habitat and territory. So let's start with habitat. What is a habitat? A habitat is a area, although that can be defined in a lot of different ways, but it is a area that has all of the resources that a particular um, animal needs to survive. Okay, so and this is actually not the slide I want to be on. I want to be on the previous slide. There we go. So it must have everything that that animal would need for survival, which includes food, water, some kind of cover protection, and most likely roosting or nesting sites, a place where it's going to reproduce. It has to have those things. Um, and with birds, you have some birds that are very, very tied to a specific kind of habitat. So one example might be a sedge wren that only nests in the edges along the of a marsh. Another might be a wood thrush that will only nest on the forest floor of a certain kind of size of forest. House wrens actually are adapted to be near people and they only nest around human habitations. Sage grouse are birds that only nest in large open areas with certain kinds of characteristics. So these are very specific, tied to specific kinds of habitats. There's another kind of strategy for survival, and those are generalist. Okay, so generalist species kind of adapt to whatever's going on. So they can eat one thing in one habitat or in one area and switch to another kind of food source somewhere else. A good example of this is the American robin. American robins are everywhere. When I was doing one of the research projects I was working on, where I was looking at a range of human development all the way from wildland forest to very developed urban settings. I found robins in all of those situations. It was amazing. They're everywhere. So once, if it's a generalist, then they can use a variety of those sources to survive. Sometimes there is a very specific requirement that humans might not at first understand. Here are a couple of good examples. The first one is this bluebird. Okay, eastern bluebird. We've learned about them already. And eastern bluebird populations in the United States started to plummet in, I think I would say, early to mid 1900s. Mid 1900s probably started to plummet. And at first we weren't sure why. Turns out that bluebirds are grassland species, right? They need open areas. Also, uh, they need a place to build their nest, and they're cavity nesters. So this means that they need to have some place where they can make a hole to have their nest. Okay. Well, in the early days of American farming, there were a lot of wooden fence posts looking over hay fields, right? This was perfect. You have grassland. These are insect eaters. They can eat the insects, and then they can use these wooden fence posts for habitat. Um, as farming began to decrease in the eastern United States and also metal fence posts came in, then that specific requirement of having a cavity for the bluebirds to nest in went away. And so a huge concerted effort went into getting everyone to put up nest boxes, and that has really, really helped the bluebird populations because they don't just require open areas, they require open areas where they have access to a place to build their nest. Another example is this bird up here in the left-hand corner. This is an American kestrel. It's one of our small hawks. And it, like hawks, is a predator, and it hunts over open grasslands. But the thing is, it needs to be able to sit and look at the grass, looking for movement before it goes over and dives in to catch the mammal, whatever it is, or snake, or whatever it is. So it turns out we've created this ideal situation, which is that we've put these wires telephone wires, electric wires, whatever, all across by these open roadside fields. So, where do you see these birds? You see them sitting on these roadside wires. If these roadside wires weren't there, my guess is the population of American kestrels would actually decrease. So that's kind of an interesting thing to note, is that we think of things like food or water as being requirements for habitat, but there are also other specific requirements that we might not be paying attention to. This is an interesting story. You can't see this bird very well here, but if you look at this little tiny picture here, this is a bird called the peregrine falcon. And if you see where it's nesting, its natural nesting spot is on cliffs. Well, because of infringement by humans putting houses near cliffs and that sort of thing, the peregrine falcon population was plummeting. And sometime, somebody figured out, you know what, we have a perfect artificial cliff situation on the sides of our high-rise buildings in our cities. Not only that, they have a perfect food source because peregrine falcons will eat pigeons. And in cities, a lot of times they would be happy to get rid of a few pigeons and give them up to peregrine falcons. So this is a great solution, right? Let's get the peregrines to live in the cities. The problem is they tried introducing adult peregrine falcons into cities, and they would migrate and not come back to that city, or they would not breed successfully, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. They finally actually hatched out some eggs in a city, and then they had a successful breeding population because these birds had site fidelity. They didn't come back to the exact same nest spot that they were born to, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but they would come back to the same city, and then they could live in the city. And now most of the big cities in the U.S. have peregrine falcons populations. I'm new enough to Vermont. I don't know if there are peregrines around, but certainly there could be in, say, Burlington or even Montpelier. So that is habitat, and that is a place that has all the needs that a bird has. But birds will actively defend an area, sometimes year-round, often just during breeding season, because these are birds that then migrate somewhere else, and they don't necessarily defend territory when they're not breeding. But a territory is an area that they have selected themselves as, this is my space. And they're going to spend effort to defend that territory and to mark it. For birds, marking it often means going from corner to corner of this area and singing very loudly their song. Or in the case of woodpeckers, it might be drumming on a tree very loudly at the edges of their territory. They vocally, or using sound, say what their territory is, mark it, let the others around know. And why do they do this? Why spend all that energy? Tremendous amounts of time and energy is spent, usually by males, defending this territory. Why? One is to secure the resources. That bird has access to all of those resources there. Reduce predation. Also to control the sexual influence of neighbors, right? If your neighbors are too close, then, you might see some exchange of DNA. Let's put it that way. So if they can keep their neighbors far enough away, they're more likely to have their DNA being passed on in the reproduction. So how big is the territory? It really depends on the bird. Some birds have very large territories. Generally speaking, the bigger the bird, the larger the territory. So an eagle is going to have a much, much larger territory than, say, a house sparrow would. Okay, what is a territory? It's just the area that's defended by an individual. Migrant birds will usually return to the same territory year after year after year. So when I was doing bird banding, I would often band the same bird year after year after year, even though it was a migratory bird that may have gone to, who knows, Mexico, Central America during the winter. It would come back to the same place, and I would often catch it again. Poor little guy. There is, however, a very important mechanism, strategy, adaptation that causes young who are born in an area to not come back to the exact same spot. So think about that for a minute. Why wouldn't you want your offspring to come and reproduce in the exact same spot? The answer is too much genetic similarity. Okay, you may have heard of genetic depression that happens when you mate with relatives. Okay, not you meaning you, of course, not you, but when any species start to reproduce with other individuals who are close to them relationally, that can create problems, health problems, and it makes you vulnerable to epidemics, things like that. And so, as a result, if you all the offspring came back to the same exact area, you'd be very likely to pick a mate that was your sister or your father or mother or whatever. So they have a very strong instinct to disperse to some degree. They'll come back to the same region, but they will not come back to that exact same spot. So when I was banding birds again, I never banded birds. So I would band birds who just come out of the nest, but then I would never see those birds again. They would go somewhere else nearby, but not to my same banding location. Okay, I think that is all I want to talk about for today. So that is what I would like you to take notes on for the habitat and territory section.